Hello everyone, welcome back to this session. Today I have the honor of chairing this session and introducing Silvia De Monte, who is a research scientist at École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Silvia did her PhD in physics, if I'm right? Working on microbial systems, collective behavior of microbial systems from Denmark, followed by moving to France, where she did her postdoc as well as established a research group. She has also been at MPI Evolutionary Biology in Plön, Germany. And she does very exciting work connecting, grouping behavior, microbial systems, all the way to eco-evolutionary dynamics. So I'm very excited to hear Silvia's upcoming talks. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. All right, thanks for this nice introduction. So we will move a bit more towards biology with my talks, even though my first talk will be more theoretical and try to connect with some notions that we have heard these days in game theory. But my primary interest in general is more on the eco-evolutionary dynamics. So how to connect populations of individuals that are different from one another in some of the traits to the dynamics of the change over time of the proportion of these types in populations. That is what typically one looks at on ecological or evolutionary times. So this is something that almost everybody does, but my specific interest is what happens when the feedbacks that go from the individual level to the population level are mediated by some structuring happening at an intermediate level. So this is what I will call collective level, as being inspired more by physics and collective behavior in physics. So collectives for me, as I will detail in the future, are ensembles of players or of individuals that can differ in their composition, they can differ in their size, and actually all these features will matter on how this kind of diversity or heterogeneity translates into the dynamics at the population level. So you could imagine that these dots are humans, but I am mostly interested in the case where these dots are cells. So mostly because cellular systems are arguably simpler than interaction between humans, and therefore we can perhaps understand a bit more the mechanisms that underpin interactions, and also we can hope to make some experiments or even observations in the wild of this kind of heterogeneous populations. So in this context, when I talk about a collective level, you can think of multicellular associations. This is what I'll be talking about mostly today and tomorrow. But also tomorrow I will speak a bit about the case of microbial communities that are, if you want, less tight associations between different individuals. Why are these collective structures interesting? Well, this is where somehow conflicts play out. And this is because if these structures, think of a body, for instance, are composed of different entities. As you can see, Chaitanya and I have the same kind of model system to study. So we all like little dots. You see a lot of these little dots, blue and red. So if you have a certain heterogeneity in color within some of these groups, then there can be conflicts of interest between these different types. And I'll be more precise what I mean by this conflict of interest. But these conflicts can play out within species. For instance, think of cancer. So cancer cells tend to reproduce faster than the cells of the host of the body where it developed. Or antibiotic resistance And we will see a lot about division of labor in aggregatively multicellular microbes. But conflicts can also occur between species. For instance, within a microbiota, you can have that certain species are more successful in colonizing a given host. So it poses the question of how holobionts that consist in the coexistence of, for instance, hosts and the microbiome are maintained over time. And a subject I'm particularly interested in, and I will not talk about, is plankton communities. So well-mixed communities where different species can have different traits. The overarching questions I will be asking is how are properties of these collective associations maintained by natural selection? And an even more tricky question is how did this functional collective emerge in the first place? So it is somehow two separate questions. One, you assume that they already exist, and the other one, you want to understand how you go from one level of organization to another one. So this is more or less the plan of my lectures. So today I will talk about groups and selection. And I will go back to some methods we have already met. So replicator dynamics, individual-based models, and adaptive dynamics in an application to the evolution of populations that are structured into groups. Tomorrow, I will apply some of these concepts to aggregative multicellularity. Specifically, I will talk a lot about Dictyostelium discoideum, the so-called social amoeba. It is a very nice system for testing some of the theoretical models. And I will tell you something about life cycles, the emergence of life cycles, and eco-evolutionary dynamics. Finally, tomorrow afternoon, I will mostly focus on multi-level selection. Looking at cases where collectives have collective genealogies. And I will present you in some detail two models, one for a two-species community or a collective, and the other one for species-rich communities. Okay, I don't know why they came later. This is basically the same slide as Chaitanya had, but I just wanted to recall that all the living world is organized into different levels of organization. And you can go from the level of molecules to possibly the level of societies or societies integrated with technologies. So there is a lot of people who try to understand how did evolution bring to this progressive complexification of the living world. And this has been in particular the subject of a lot of research in evolutionary biology since Minor Smith and Satsmary pointed out that there is a number of really important transitions that happened at a certain point in life. And with these transitions, the structure of the living world went from one level to another level. And these levels are characterized by the fact that there were some lower level units that were able to replicate at a certain level. And then these lower level units, they become integrated within a higher level organism or structure that is itself able to self-replicate. So here you have a sort of an updated list of all these kind of transitions. There are very heterogeneous transitions here. Some of them happen multiple times. Some of them happened probably just once. One important distinction that was done by David Queller in 2000 is between transitions that allow the higher level unit that contains then the lower level units to be heterogeneous in terms of its components. For instance, think of a symbiosis. So the components of the symbiosis, they can autonomously, or at least originally they could autonomously replicate, and they are maintained, both of them, in the higher level symbiotic unit. So these are called egalitarian transitions, whereas transitions where the higher level unit is basically uniform in terms of the units that compose it are called fraternal. And I'll go back to this later. Another important distinction that was brought up mostly by Samir Okasha, who's a philosopher of biology in this book, is the difference between diachronic and synchronic points of view. So this relates to asking whether you can understand a structure that is already existing, as I was mentioning before, with respect to understanding how this structure came about. So it's not the same kind of question, and actually understanding how it comes about, as several people argued, requires understanding something about the mechanisms that are involved in this transition. So not only the ultimate cause, what's the big purpose of this other level of organization, but also what are the proximate causes, how did this level emerge? So for basically my effort in general is try to stick to this how. So try to understand how did functional groups of cells emerge and how they are maintained. Now let me briefly introduce a kind of narrative that is very common when people think of one particular transition, that is a transition from unicellularity to multicellularity, which will be mostly the focus of my talks today and tomorrow. So here are our sort of virtual units. Let's say at the individual level, you could have, I don't know, genes, cells, or species. Imagine it's cells that can replicate on their own, and they have a certain trait. And here is a collective, for instance, a multicellular body that contains a diverse set of these cells, and that can replicate on its own as well. And the properties of this body will somehow depend on the properties of the cells. For instance, what we will see in several examples later on, you could say, okay, the property of the collective is the color of this collective. So somehow the percentage of blue cells in the collective. So if you have as much blue cells as red cells, then you will have a purple kind of collective. Okay, this is just the color code I'll be using. So let's imagine that the red cells are somehow providing something positive to the multicellular aggregate. And then you have, like a well-functioning body. Each cell is paying a cost to contribute to the total function. But then for one reason or another, you have a blue cell that appears in this setting. And this blue cell is exploiting the red cell, reaping the benefits of the investment of other cells, but using these benefits to reproduce because it is not investing any cost into this collective function. So the typical narrative is that if you keep going and you keep this collective the same, then in the end, you will basically get rid completely of the collective function and probably of the collective itself. So this concept that was introduced by Garrett Hardin under the name of the tragedy of the commons has been then picked up in evolutionary biology, and it is nowadays commonly used to justify why we should be interested in understanding the evolution of multicellularity, through the eyes of game theory and through the eyes of the evolution of cooperation. Okay, I want just to stress, and I'll go back to this, that here there is basically the assumption that this group is not changing. So you have some reproduction that occurs within this group, and this conclusion is really heavily based on some strong assumptions. Yeah. Because the bad one is not paying the cost to maintaining the collective function. So exactly, it is advantage, then it grows faster, and then its proportion will increase in the group. It's a bit like, you know, cancer. It doesn't pay the cost to maintain the organism under this view, and then it grows faster than other cells that are instead keeping their growth rate lower because they want to maintain the functionality of the body. Exactly, yeah, but let's say even in that case, you have perhaps a higher chance of ending up badly the more the difference is in this fitness. So here there is somehow an equation between fitness and payoff. I'll go back to this. Okay, then the typical question is, if selection acting on lower level units opposes higher level functions, for instance, cooperation, complexity, and so on and so forth, how are these maintained, and why did life develop as it did? So let me now introduce very briefly some of the debate that has gone on for decades, and I think is now sort of resolved, but just to let you know about this group selection approaches and how people have used the different arguments for and against it. So Darwin already in The Origin of Species and The Descent of Man had introduced this idea that groups that are composed by altruistic individuals who contribute more to the well-being of the group will be favored over groups of selfish individuals. And he was saying, okay, this can be the reason why actually we have societies. But he also realized that this was a bit of a shaky argument with respect to his theory of natural selection based on individual advantage. But let's say it was something that he believed that could be used as an argument, so that certain features, certain traits may evolve for the good of the group or of the species and not necessarily for the good of the individual. So much later, this idea was sort of formalized by mostly two people. So Peter Kropotkin was one of the fathers of anarchy, and he proposed that people should evolve traits that are altruistic towards others for the maintenance of the well-being of the group. And this idea was also very much supported and developed by Vero Wine-Edwards, who started a real sort of a war about how this is important in evolutionary biology. So in this book that I really highly recommend, that retraces somehow how this idea that group level selection may be very important for explaining certain social traits, is pointing out that both Kropotkin and Wine-Edwards were starting from being ecologists of Arctic ecosystems. And this is very different with respect to Darwin. Darwin had in his mind the tangled bank, tropical ecosystems. So these two thinkers had in their mind as a biological model ecosystems where resources are very scarce and where actually not all the individuals can reproduce at the same time. And what they were trying to understand is why not every bird, for instance, in an Arctic colony reproduce every year. So the debate was really quite intense between the 70s and the 80s, where there were two polarized opinions in the community. So on the one hand, there were people who said, oh, this is rubbish, because actually natural selection acts at the level of the individual or even the genes, so within individuals, so to really lower level entities. And some other people like David Sloan Wilson and Elliot Sober, who were instead saying, okay, look, but this is anyway a useful concept that is able to let us understand how structure in populations may be helping the evolution of certain traits. So what Wilson proposed was a very simple model that sort of illustrates why selection at the level of groups can be important in driving the evolution of cooperation. So imagine you have a population that has A and B individuals. I'm not sure if you can really read this. It's pretty small. So there are some individuals who are actually cooperators and that pay a cost, but by paying this cost, they are allowing their group to fare better. And some other individuals that, on the contrary, don't pay the cost, but then the group will have, if you want, a lower payoff at the level of the group. So you let these groups, so to say, develop, and then all the individuals that belong to one or the other group will be shuffled, and then you form randomly again other groups. So just by the fact that you are grouping individuals for a certain time, then it is possible to bias evolution towards having an increased frequency of cooperators. And as Wilson stressed, so what is important here is actually that the absolute fitness of the donor is large, and this is regardless of its relative fitness within a group. I will be more precise in a couple of slides. So kin selection, that was the kind of explanation that was given as an alternative to group selection to explain the evolution of social traits, is somehow a special case of this general theory, because it refers to one specific structure of the population. And so, he specifically stressed that group selection never really violates the concepts of individual selection. Despite all these disclaimers, in the end, the general feeling was that actually it was individual selection who won, and the group selection became a sort of a heresy. And one of the most influential people driving this kind of shift was John Maynard Smith, who proposed this so-called haystack model, where you have two kinds of mice. So two alleles. One allele is restrained mice that is using up its resources slowly. And then you have a mice that is instead using up its resource very fast. And the argument is that actually these mice, once they have exhausted their own resource, they will just migrate to other haystacks. And therefore, there will be no way to, in general, unless you completely prevent this kind of dispersal, to avoid the greedy mice to invade the whole population, or the greedy allele. So this does not mean that group selection is not existent. His argument was more, it is basically, unrealistic. So just to go in the direction of the fact that so group selection is not something that is outlandish, it is just probably another way to looking at population structure. There are a series of researchers who have really made this very clear. So in this, in particular in this paper by Michael Debely and Flechter, they pointed out that what is really important in all these models, kin or group selection, is what is the probability that a cooperator player is meeting another cooperator? And what is the probability that it encounters a defector? And then these probabilities are actually dependent on plenty of things, typically group structure, how groups are formed, population structure. And however these are determined, in the end you will end up, if you have a kind of a cooperative game, with a relation that looks like Hamilton's rule. So you will have a condition on the ratio between cost and benefits that allow for the evolution of the more cooperative strategy. And in other papers, so people like Banker and Peter Godfrey-Smith have argued that, so it's true, they are equivalent, but perhaps one point of view is better than the other depending on what question you're asking. But I think that the most important point that was made by Debely again is that the real problem is not that much to say, okay, is one kind of selection better than the other, but to understand how do we actually end up having these expectations of who we meet. So now I will be a bit more precise, giving you an example about how group selection can work, or at least how you can look at the evolution of a population of units that are, again, two types under their structuring into groups. So let's say you have these individuals and then you divide them in big G groups randomly. Okay, you just sample randomly this population. And so in group K, we'll have a certain proportion pk of individuals of one type. And now if you want to know what is this initial proportion of blue individuals, you can either know the proportion in the whole population, or you can average over the proportions over the groups. That's equivalent. Now let's put some dynamics in it. So this is like an initial time tau. And now you can imagine that each one of these groups will undergo an ecological dynamics that is due to the fact that type red, for instance, is a defector and type blue is a cooperator. And the proportions of cooperators and defectors within each group will change over time, but the size of the group will also change over time. And now at another time, at tau prime, you will have different sizes and prime k and a different proportion p prime k. And if you want to know now what is the proportion of red individuals in the population, you have to average over all these groups. Yeah?
So you have 3 groups now?
Yeah.
And in each group there is some dynamics because of which numbers are changing.
Yeah.
But it looks like there's only birth, death process. Why is the group size increasing?
Well, it depends on what is the collective advantage that is given to being blue, for instance. So let's say that the proportion of blues determines what is the net growth rate of the group. So in this case, the net growth rate is positive, so the group will expand. In this case, it's negative because you have a few blue, and then you will have death, effectively.
Total number of particles in each group is not conserved.
No, it's not conserved. No.
But the total population across the groups, is that conserved?
So if it is conserved, then the difference in the proportion of red and before at time tau and at time tau prime, then can be written like this. It doesn't need necessarily to be conserved, but let's say if it is conserved, then this is basically if you want the fitness. With n, so if I assume that n at time tau prime is the same as n at time tau, then this is, if you want, the fitness of one type over the other, and can be written like this, where you can see that in general, so let's say that the red are the bad guys. Sorry, without realizing, I switched the colors, so sometimes red is good, sometimes it's bad. So let's imagine that so within groups, no, sorry, red, yeah, here is the bad guy, red. So let's say the proportion of blue decreases inside each of the groups. So this is the assumption to say, okay, the difference between blue and red is that red is not paying the cost of cooperation. So if there was no difference in the group size between time tau and tau prime, then this would mean that there's no way the blue strategy can invade. But if there is a difference between these two time steps, then there are conditions in which this quantity can be positive. So you can have a positive fitness despite, on average, over the whole population, despite the fact that within each group, it is always red that is increasing in proportion. And this is basically what Wilson was saying. So what matters is absolute and not relative fitness. You should not just look within a group. But this also points out that the group dynamics is actually important to know what will be the outcome of selection. So just to give you a concrete example, so some people made a very clever experiment where they showed that this so-called Simpson's paradox is actually can help selecting bacteria, in this case, who are producing a public good. So you have two kinds of bacteria. Some of them produce an antidote to an antibiotic, and the others don't. Those who produce the antidote are growing less than those who do not produce it, because they are producing this, and because also in this case they are marked with a fluorescent marker. So what so Chuang and Leibler and others have done is that they had a lot of groups, or if you want, a lot of cultures with different proportions of producers and non-producers. So the producers were necessary for the non-producers to survive, because the non-producers alone, if you add antibiotic, they will be killed. So they had these cultures grow, and then they sampled them, they diluted them out to a very small number of cells, and then let them grow again. And by doing this, they created some variance between the proportion of producer cells that were present at the next generation of pipetting, the next growth phase. And what they observed is that starting with a small proportion of producers, they ended up with a large majority of producers, whereas the non-producers were supposed to be, I mean, they are the winners in a well-mixed case, but if you split it out into groups that have this kind of dynamics, then they basically get extinct. So it is possible to obtain, indeed, the evolution of cooperators, if you want, or of producers, if you impose the right kind of group dynamics. Now, if you go back to the general formula that you can have, this holds in the case where n prime, so the number of individuals at time tau prime is different from the number at time tau. So this formula is somehow, it's a general, it's just the sum of the relative weights, the relative weighted sums of the proportions at time tau and tau prime, but it doesn't tell you anything about how do I choose this tau and tau prime. So often when we think about games, okay, there is a round of games. Who tells me when is the right moment where we are playing the game? So there is an issue of timescales, and actually for, perhaps if you're doing an experiment in a lab, well, it's you who decide. If you're doing an experiment with microbes, it's you who decides, you let them grow for 24 hours, and then you passage them. But in natural settings, who decides when are individuals playing the game? Also, something that is really critical is what is the relation between group K at time tau and group K at time tau prime? Yeah. Yeah, I guess the idea is that if you consider the producer and non-producers, so the non-producers will grow faster than producers in the absence of antibiotics. So they forego paying the cost of producing the antidote to the antibiotic. So there is this structure of the fact that actually by defecting you are gaining something, and by producing you are actually benefiting everybody else, including those who are not producing. So it's a bit of a structure of a public goods game. So the public good would be just the antidote, the enzyme that is getting rid of the antibiotic. So another thing that I will focus on now is where do these groups come from in the first place? So again, if we set a game in the lab, we can say, okay, these groups, I decide that 5 individuals are grouped together, but in nature, actually groups are not like defined once and for all and given by God. They come typically by a process of self-organization, niche construction, or you can think of some ecological constraints that scaffold somehow this group dynamics. So the rest of my talk will be about a few models of how groups can form, and I will try to show that depending on the hypothesis you make on how groups get formed, then you can get more or less easily the evolution of cooperation given the right rules of group formation. So again, we start from this population of players. In most of the cases, I'll call them socials or asocials. I'll explain what it means. Let's start considering them like operators and defectors. And these guys get somehow organized into groups. And these groups differ in general in size and in composition. And then I also have bolts in my presentation. Some of them will be selected out of the population. And you will go through sort of rounds of this. So once they get selected out, the particles or players who are here will be redistributed, and then you go back and forth. So you sort of assume that this alternation exists. And what I want to change here is basically this arrow. How do you go from free living individuals to groups? Pardon? No, exactly. That's what I'll tell you. So it might or it might not. Let's say, okay. Let's consider a few examples, and then it will become more clear. So this is, I wanted to dig into some very old work, which, by the way, I realized I never presented. A hypothesis that one could do is that beside cooperators and defectors, in a population you have a third kind of player, that is a player who does not participate to the game. We called it loner at that time. So when groups are formed, groups will be formed by players who have their strategy, but loners will just stay outside, and they will have a payoff that is small but constant. So it's a bit of a version of the stag hunt game, where actually you form groups to hunt stags, and this would be those who chase hares. Okay, those who chase hares, they don't care really what's going on within the group. That's the dynamics, the social dynamics within the group. And within groups, we assumed that players play a public good game. That is, the benefits of this game are proportional to the number of cooperators in the group. And so the cooperators will bear a cost for contributing to these benefits. So the important thing is that so groups are formed with drawing n particles from the population, but the actual size of the group depends on how many loners are there, because you might draw a loner. So there will be a distribution of group size in this population. It is possible to compute the payoff of the factors with respect to cooperators. So it all boils down to a replicator equation with this payoff difference. That is some nonlinear function of the proportion of loners Z in the population. And what is interesting about this nonlinear function is that despite its being pretty complicated, it has a very simple kind of dynamics. So when the benefits are large enough, what you would have is that, so if we start here, so this is the case where the population is mostly composed by loners. So if you have mostly loners, when you are sampling groups from this population, you will have some groups that are small enough so that one individual will make the difference. So if I decide to cooperate, actually I will get a higher payoff than if I decide to defect in small groups. So this means that there will be some people who start to cooperate. It will be more and more common cooperation, but then at a certain point, as cooperation becomes more common, then defection becomes more and more attractive, and then there will be nothing to stop defectors, except that at a certain point, instead of being in a group of defectors that sucks, you just go hunt for hare. And so you will have this dynamics whereby you have an increase in cooperation, then an increase in defection, and then you will end up again having a few people who enter the groups. So this dynamics keeps forever. Yeah. 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 Loner is doing nothing in the public good. No. Yes, but the defector enters the public good. So it is getting its share of the public good, whereas the loner is not getting any share. It's just, it doesn't participate to the game at all. It just lets them go. So with just this simple hypothesis, so you are adding one strategy to the public good game, then you see that you can maintain cooperation forever. Of course, this is maintained in a cyclical way. There are some very interesting properties of this system. It turns out that it is a Miltonian system. The average over all these oscillations ends up being the same as being the equilibrium. Anyway, many different things. It is still a pretty pathological system from the point of view of dynamical systems, because it has this infinite number of possible cyclic solutions. So you don't really have one specific time scale. Yeah, it's more one of these models that show that it is possible than anything. But people have tried to apply this and made experiments, found oscillations. It's a qualitative, not a quantitative model. Yeah. So you have a marginally stable equilibrium here. And then you have these three saddle equilibria that are connected with these non-transitive relationships. So the cooperators invite the loners, the defectors invite cooperators, and loners invade the defectors. So if you go here, then you will start cycling. So this is exactly like the Lotka-Volterra dynamics. Is not a limit cycle. It has the predator, usual predator-prey Lotka-Volterra cycles are not limit cycles. They do not have a specific amplitude and a specific frequency. There are an infinite number of cycles. And this is because in these cases, there are some conserved quantities, like for Hamiltonian systems in physics, there's an energy here. So that's why I'm saying that is not really a realistic kind of model, but it just, lets you think that actually the moment in which you allow some dynamics on the groups and let these groups depend, the size here is important, it depends on, a third strategy that has nothing to do with what happens really in the groups, then you can have some interesting outcome. So I'll go back to this tomorrow with a real-life example. So always back in 2002, there were other people who were thinking about grouping and cooperation. So in a series of papers by Laetitia Aviles and then also with Matthijs van Vellen later on, they started thinking, what if there are different traits that determine not only whether I'm a cooperator or a defector, but also if I want or not to be part of a group. So initially with some numerical simulation, they found that actually evolution leads to a sort of an association of a linkage disequilibrium towards the association between cooperation and being social or being willing to enter a group. And so I like very much this title. It takes grouping and cooperation to get sociality. So you also need to take into account this willingness to join a common endeavor. And so inspired partially by this, we also developed a model that was meant to describe more or less the life cycle that we will see tomorrow of dictyostelium. So you start with a population where you have a fraction of individuals that are socials. So socials, in this case, will have two implications, both on grouping tendency and on the contribution to the function of the group. Think, for instance, that social individuals are individuals who are producing a glue. So this glue is important for entering groups. So the more you are sticky, the more you will stick to other cells. But it is also important to maintain the coherence of a group. So a group that is made of sticky cells will last longer and will possibly have some function that cannot be achieved by a group of cells that are not sticky. So now we suppose that there is some kind of group formation that is based on differential attachment, or actually, I will show you an example where it is based on differential attachment. And then once the groups are formed, so these groups may be groups or there may be individuals who do not belong to any group. Those who belong to a group will play a public good game, exactly as we saw before. And then you can compute what is the difference in average payoff of red versus blue types. Okay, it's a bit like the trait group model, but now groups self-organize based on these traits. So within groups, the payoff of social individuals will be so a public good game. So there will be a part of the payoff that depends on the behavior of the individual independent of all the others. So you will get a share of the public good just by the fact that you cooperate, and you will pay a cost. Of course, if B over N is smaller than C, then basically there's no chance you can get cooperation. But you can, sorry, it's not true that there is no chance, but it's much more difficult. But what is important is what is the expected number of other cooperators that a social individual will encounter in the group. This is like Flechter and Döbelis formula. So the factors will be the same. The only thing is that they will not pay the cost. And this is the expected number of social individual or cooperators that the factor is expecting to meet. So this allows to express in general form the payoff difference of social versus asocial individuals based on two parts. One part that is due to self, and one part that is due to the interaction environment. So the kind of quantities that appear in this equation are the distribution of the size of groups that are seen by social and asocial individuals after group formation occurs. So this is basically the same kind of Bayesian formula that we saw in the previous days. And the expected number of social players, social co-players in a group of size n. So once you know these two distributions, you can say, okay, is sociality going to invade or not? Now let me more specific, and let's say exactly, I give you an example of how groups may form. So imagine that you have like a deme made of T individuals. So these T individuals are randomly chosen from an infinite population. Then one individual in this group will be chosen as the recruiter. So this is the one that is nucleating a group. And then all other individuals will try once to interact with this individual, and they may stick to the individual, and in that case, they will be part of the group, or they may not stick, and then they will remain outside. So in order to know what is the probability that individuals stick, we need to precise, in principle, 4 numbers. So what is the probability that an asocial individual is sticking to a social recruiter, or a social individual to a social recruiter, and the 4 combinations. So we want to be consistent with the idea that there are social and asocial individuals. Asocial individuals will have a lower probability to stick to asocials. Socials will have the maximal probability to stick to socials. And we will assume that the probability that a social sticks to an asocial is independent of who is the recruiter between the two. So we want to make a further assumption because we don't want this process to be biased. For instance, if there is like preferential assortment, let's say social individuals recognize social individuals, then you might just have that groups are mostly separated. You will have groups that are mostly made by socials and groups that are mostly made by asocials. So by choosing this relation between these 3 parameters, so you are reducing yourself to having just 2 parameters, you have an unbiased process, so there's no a priori assortment between socials and asocials. So said in a different way, the fraction of social co-players is the same for socials and asocials if you consider the whole population. And now let's see what happens to the group size under these rules of aggregation. So if you, first of all, let's imagine you have very few socials. What will happen is that most individuals will be alone. They will just not stick to anybody. And then there will be some groups that get formed typically around a social recruiter. So if you pick a social recruiter at the beginning, then they will manage to collect some other people around them. And then once this happens, you can compute what is the payoff of the two strategies with the formula I gave you before. And you will find that if the initial fraction of social players is large enough, it's not really clear here, so we do not start from 0, but it can be very small. You will have that social individuals will get a payoff advantage, and therefore they will increase in frequency in the next round. If they increase in frequency, groups will progressively become of larger and larger size, and eventually you will have that basically all individuals will be social. This will not mean that all individuals will be grouped. There will be still some individuals that remain alone just by chance, but most individuals will belong to groups, and these groups will cooperate. Okay, and this is the consequence of the fact that cooperation and grouping sort of go together. Yeah. Yes.
Social type and 80 individuals of social type, or what did you discover then?
So this is the distribution of group size that is seen by socials is the red, and that is seen by asocials is the blue. So here you still have some blues. So the blues will be more often alone than in groups, and socials will be more often in groups than alone. But both socials and asocials will observe groups that are roughly of the same size when they're grouped. Because they get recruited together with socials.
So it's a group which has both socials and asocials.
Yes, because by this rule does not exclude the social attached to non-social to a social. You know, there is a probability that they will attach. So if you have a social recruiter, actually, even if you have a social recruiter, in principle, they can attach together. But these are social recruiters sort of do not exist in the long run. So here you have two distributions. These are groups that attach to a social recruiter, and these are groups that are nucleated by an asocial one. In the end, you will basically have only social recruiters because it's mostly socials. And then, you know, in a social group, you might have asocials. This is not going to hamper the evolution of sociality. Yes, which is related to also your tendency of cooperate. I mean, what I think here is mostly, you know, if you have cells and they are producing a glue, then this glue has not just one single function. It's not just affecting the way groups are formed, it is also affecting the properties of the group. So you can have traits that are pleiotropic. Actually, this happens all the time in microbes. And then this will have a double influence. Of course, if you consider these are two separate traits, I'll tell something about this because Vishwesha has worked on this. In our case, since we were interested in these microbes, we assume that these are aligned.
At this point, it's all genetic evolution. It's not culture, gene.
No, this is all genetic. So the fact that you are social or asocial is just determined by what type you are. Well, you have one recruiter for every group. So you make groups of size T in an infinite population, so you will have an infinite number of recruiters. So the proportion of the probability of recruiting, of having a social recruiter will be the same as the probability of having a social individual. No, that at the beginning can be small. Yeah. That is X. So just to give you another view more or less on the same thing. So we did this individual maze model where now you have particles that move around. These particles are sticky and they have different stickiness. So the red particles are more sticky than the blue particles. And then they are let self-organize into groups. And once the groups are formed, then we just, once the groups are formed, somehow the particles keep moving around. So after a certain time, we will just stop the simulation, count what is the average payoff of particles, red or blue particles, they are inside groups, and assign some payoff. I forgot whether it's 0 or some little payoff to the particles that are alone. And now we want to see in this setting that is more correspondent to what we observe in experiments, can we still see the evolution of more sticky particles? Okay, again, stickiness plays the role of the contribution to the public good. No, no, the most sticky groups are those that are made by just red. Than blue, exactly. Yes, so if you assign a given proportion of red and blue, in general, if blue is not in proportion 0, there will be some blue that end up in the groups. Just because, you know, they encounter reds. Reds are more sticky. So they will stick more both to blue and red. Yeah, so the lone individuals are more likely to be blue than red. So you can actually compute this and show that this is actually the key point in computing the payoff here is what is basically the rate of leaving the groups and remaining alone. Yeah. So yeah, this will depend on the time scale at which we stop the simulation. So let's say we tend to leave this reach some sort of steady state. We didn't try what happens if we stop it immediately. Of course, the shortest is the time of your observation, the less they will be assorted and the more difficult it will be to evolve sociality. So this is a real key point. So this goes back to the question of what is the time scale of interactions. So at infinite time, yes, there should be a single clump of the red type, probably with the blue type outside, and there will be some evaporation. This is, is like a glassy transition. It will take a long, long time to get to this asymptotic state. We never saw it in simulations. So they stay like this because once the group is formed, it's still drifting around, but very, very slowly. So merging of groups happens extremely slowly. Okay, so now if we, these are self-propelled particles who have short-range interactions. So once two particles are close enough, they start feeling one another. And this is where adhesion comes into play. So there is an elastic interaction between these two kinds of particles, and the constant of this interaction will depend on the nature of the two particles. So two social particles will have this return constant that is higher than two asocial ones. So if now, we compute the payoff and now we have multiple rounds of this aggregation, then if we start with, again, a small but not zero number of of red particles. These red particles will tend to nucleate groups, and they will lead to the evolution eventually of 100% red types. And these red types, they form groups in a way that is much more efficient than at the beginning of the evolutionary process. So it's just you know, individual-based version of the model I presented before. Yeah. Yeah. Of what? Sorry. Yeah. So this is not parameterized to anything real. So this is basically the round of interaction. So at each generation, you take, for instance, this is the end of one generation. And you take all the particles, you spread them uniformly again, and then you let them aggregate. After a certain time, you freeze, you compute the payoff, then take those particles, so have the particles here, reproduce according to the payoff within groups. So red particles and blue particles that belong to the same group will have the same benefits. And based on these benefits, you can compute what is the average benefit of the red and the blue type. And this is, so this generation is just the number of rounds you are playing this game. The only thing is that instead of having rounds that are defined a priori here, the group, so instead of having groups defined a priori, these groups get formed during the course of this generation, starting from particles that are scattered uniformly. Okay, tomorrow you'll see a biological example of this kind of life cycle. So what is interesting here is that we can play a bit with the parameters of these particles. For instance, we can change the speed of motion of social players. And then it turns out that depending on the speed, you get different solutions. You do not always select for sociality. So you need that particles stick together for long enough. For instance, if the speed is too high, then you will have that groups do not keep together, and then there is no way they can accrue this collective benefits. Okay, as I was mentioning, Vishu and colleagues have worked on models that have some common feature with the model I talked about, so where you have moving particles that can have, in their case, separate traits of sociality and cooperation. And yeah, it's very interesting work. They find eco-evolutionary cycles. So I let you talk to him if you want to have more details. And since I still have some time, I would like to move towards a real evolutionary model. So this model I talked about so far is not really evolutionary. I mean, you have two types, and you're looking basically at the ecology of this model over multiple rounds of aggregation and dispersion. Okay, so this, so the traits, the social traits are not evolving. So now what we asked is, what happens if, let's say, the degree of stickiness is given by a genetically inherited trait, and this trait can mutate? Then what should I expect? So here, what we call Z here is a quantitative trait that measures the probability of adhering to a group upon encounter. So as I was mentioning before, and you could expect, if you have a population that is all made by individuals that have the same Z, as you increase Z, as you increase stickiness, you will get groups that are larger and larger. And here groups are formed in the same way as I was saying before with the recruiter and then interactions within a finite size T. So given this value of Z, one can compute what is the proportion of individuals that are alone and what is the proportion of individuals in groups of different size. And this size will depend on Z as well. And now we can ask, so if I have a population that is monomorphic in Z, and now I add one individual that has a different Z prime, so will this individual invade? So let's say that you introduce a more sticky individual. So there is a theoretical framework that allows to do this kind of calculation, and this is the adaptive dynamics framework. So before I tell you how to deal with this, I forgot to specify that in this case, so you always, players are always playing a public good game. Now the public good is the average addition within a group. So if all groups have the same Z, if all individuals have the same Z, then this would be just Z. And according to this, sorry, I think actually it's not the average, I think it's the total addition. I think this is wrong. So this is Z times N in a group of size N. And so the fitness of a cell will depend on so the benefit that is obtained by the stickiness of all the other cells in a group minus a cost that is proportional to the amount of stickiness it is itself producing. So this is the idea that if you are producing a public good, you pay a cost that is proportional to the amount of public good you are producing. Okay, this is the simplest possible hypothesis. So B in this case is measuring the benefit from group coherence, and C the cost of producing the glue. So now in adaptive dynamics, what one does is to suppose that mutations happen very seldom. So you can think that when you add a mutant, you always add it to a situation where the population is monomorphic. So you add a mutant Z in a population that has otherwise all individuals playing Z hat. And now you can compute what is called the invasion fitness, that is the fitness of this one single mutant in a population of residents. And this can be done in this case. And again, this invasion fitness depends on two parts. There is a part that depends on the ungrouped individuals. So how does the distribution of ungrouped individual changes with Z? And then you have another part that depends on the group size distribution. So by plotting this invasion fitness, you will know when does a mutant has a higher fitness than the resident. And the assumption, which is generally true if you make a numerical simulation, is that if initially the mutant has a higher fitness than the resident, then it will substitute the resident, and then you will need to wait until a new mutant appears and see has this mutant a higher fitness or not. So if it has a lower fitness, it will just be discarded. So you represent this typically in what is called the pairwise invisibility plot. So this part, the black parts, indicate the case where the mutant wins, and the white parts, the cases where the resident wins. So let's say I start here, so at a level of resident stickiness that is intermediate. Now, if I get a mutant with higher stickiness, they will win, and therefore the next generation, so they will invade, and I am moving upwards along this diagonal. And on the contrary, if I am starting with very, very small stickiness, then I will evolve towards this other evolutionary stable strategy. So the two evolutionary stable strategies are either everybody is social and is grouped, or everybody is social and is alone. And what is interesting is that now, provided you start with a minimal amount of stickiness, you don't need to have a threshold of individuals who are more sticky. So one single individual is enough to drive these dynamics towards more stickiness. This part? Yeah, this part, so if you are down here, then you have a mutation that is favoring the resident. So you are in the white. So your mutant, this is the mutant. Sorry, I go up. So the mutant has a higher stickiness. Then this is not favored, so it will be the resident wins and you don't move at all on the diagonal. So it's like here, if you have a mutant that has a lower stickiness, then the resident wins, you just stay there. You have to wait until you have a mutant that has higher stickiness to then move upwards. So only here in this part, only mutations that increase stickiness will invade. And here, only mutations that decrease stickiness will invade. Yeah, this region, yeah, what is the problem with this region? I mean, here, if you increase stickiness, it will not invade. No. I mean, it's the same as here. Resident wins, and here, I mean, this region is small, you don't really see it, but the mutant wins down here as well. So actually, if I draw it, you know, you have something like this. Okay, so this is the black part. So if I start here, I go up, then I will fix, this will be my new resident, is the mutant who has higher stickiness, and therefore I will keep going up. But if I once get a mutation that brings me down, then I'm just going back to the same point on the diagonal. Okay, and this is the opposite here. If I have a mutant that goes up, it doesn't make me change position in the diagonal, but if I have a mutant that goes down, it will make me converge towards 0. Okay, this is a bit of an extreme example. Just one thing I wanted to stress is that one can wonder which kind of benefits are social individuals receiving, because there has been a sort of classification of different kind of cooperative behavior in groups in evolutionary biology. So there are some benefits that are, so some behaviors that are classified as altruistic because there is no direct benefit to the player who is actually contributing to the public good or who is cooperating, whereas there are other cases where actually you get direct benefits. So the fact that you are contributing to the public good is also directly affecting your own fitness. You get a bit of share of what you are contributing, and when this share is large enough, then actually that's enough to maintain cooperation. It's somehow trivial because you are sort of getting the gain of your own contribution. So if we look at the trajectories, the evolutionary trajectories of this system, it turns out that you always start being altruistic. So when you have just one player that is more social, it will not get direct benefits because it is too rare. And in some cases, so when the benefit is sufficiently small, then this will be the case for all times. You will never get to get direct benefits. But if B is sufficiently large, then you might at a certain point start to enter this region where you get direct benefits. Apart from this classification, what is interesting here is that the way you think about the social strategy changes over evolutionary time. So it's not just attributable to the fact that you are increasing sociality. The meaning of this increase will depend on the parameters, but will also depend on your trajectory that starts here and then goes up. So the trajectory I showed you before is this. So you start somewhere here and then you increase the residence Z progressively. So in this case, all this trajectory will be altruistic. In this case, it will start altruistic and then become direct benefit.
So that bistability is not equivalent to speciation.
No, in order to have speciation, you would need an internal fixed point. So the arrows should go in the opposite direction and it should be transversally unstable. And then, yeah, you have divergence. So you have the two different types can coexist. So this is like evolutionary branching, but we never observe this in this system. Okay, just to finish, so it is a bit unrealistic if you think about, real cells that they end up being all clumped in a single group. This is not what we observe, for instance, for the amoeba. But we can obtain something where you have the second, let's say, the highly social evolutionary stable strategy that is such that only a fraction of cells will aggregate. And in order to obtain this linear kind of picture, it is enough to assume that the cost is not linear in the production of the stickiness. So somehow, once you could saturate the cost of production, and then you get this kind of pairwise invisibility plot. Okay, tomorrow I will tell you more about dictyostelium and how we try to make to understand whether this whole kind of theoretical framework can be used or not, and under what circumstances for a real system where there are actually cells that co-aggregate. They can have different types, they can end up being alone, they can end up being in groups, and these groups have a function. Thank you very much for your attention.
Have some time for questions now. I know you're all hungry, so maybe a couple of quick questions and then we can wrap up and continue discussions over lunch.
I mean, a very naive thought, and I want to know where it's sort of wrong. So usually when we sort of talk about something evolving, it's our outward appearance or the phenotype which is sort of tries to be compatible with the environment, and adaptation happens and it gets selected. Now we know that our individual characteristics, we cannot just add up characteristics and say we get a new characteristic. At group level, we can have quote unquote group phenotypes kind of thing, right? Yeah. And they will adapt with what kind of environment you have. So what is wrong with group selection in that sense? Is it only that group cannot replicate itself, or? And if I just like that.
Yeah, I think there's nothing wrong with group selection. I mean, the only thing is that It is true that if one thinks of groups that are all the time randomly assorted, then there is a problem. There is a conflict between the fact that if these group level phenotypes rely on some kind of investment of the cells or the lower level units, and if, and this is not at all obvious in biological system, if the lower level units can avoid paying this cost, then you have this potential conflict that happens within the groups. And if you always assort groups at random, then this conflict eventually will bring, those who pay less cost to exploit those who pay the cost. So this is, is true, but it's a very extreme scenario that probably in the moment in which you start thinking about real systems is, in my opinion, not that relevant.
Um, uh, from what I understand about how the group selection debate happened, people were mostly worried that group selection was being the way it was being philosophically put together was something along the lines of individual traits are being selected for by how well they are able to increase the overall fitness of the group the individual finds themselves in. And this was what John Maynard Smith and later scientists were not happy with the way group selection was essentially being used to explain away sort of cooperation. And when John Maynard Smith sort of started EGT, he sort of used it in a way to realize that individual selection itself was strong enough to cause cooperation to be an evolutionarily stable strategy for a population. So, and even in the later things that you described that people sort of explained with group selection, they immediately they brought it back to in a way that the traits altruism would sort of be supported only when there is more benefit than cost to the individual. So in that sense, this is still individual selection, but you are just looking at individual selection of how it affects groups. That's not the same thing as group selection. It's simply looking at individual selection and its effects over groups, which is extremely okay. But assuming that two groups compete with each other and traits which are a smaller thing to look at are being selected in a way that benefits the group's entire fitness is not right.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of semantic mess in this field, and I agree with you that probably the arguments that Wine-Edwards was trying to put forward were, a bit sloppy from the point of view of semantics, and that sort of caused the people to say, this is absolutely relevant, and so on and so forth. But it is still true, however you want to call it, that in the moment in which you need to evaluate an average fitness, it matters if groups are there or not. And so this, you can say this is individual selection, because in the end, of course, the payoff of a group is calculated based on the features of the composing units. But it is also true that if groups were not there, or if they were composed differently, then you would get a different answer.
Right, but sort of using groups as like a unit, which sort of interact the same way as individuals do within the group, and then assuming that group selection is then a thing which guides the evolution of traits of individuals within a group does not work as well, which is why when evolutionary game theory was brought up, it essentially sort of showed that understanding group selection dynamics was already pretty unclear of how we are going to bring it back to a smaller unit because traits in the end will be evolving, allele frequencies have to change, but we are looking at an interaction between two groups. So that was already pretty difficult. So when EGT was brought up, it essentially stayed within the same realm of individuals and traits of individuals and allele frequencies changing of the population. And that's sort of why they were able to show that individual selection is sufficient to explain cooperative
as I
behavior.
said, it's basically equivalent. I mean, it depends how you count things. Do you
Right.
count, you first group and then count, or you first count and then group? I mean, it's in the end you get to the same conclusion. But so we will see tomorrow cases where you really have clearly group level selection because you can impose it. You can say, okay, now I'm looking at a group and I will select this group to reproduce other groups based on a feature of the group. It will, of course, be still based on what the individuals within the group do.
Okay, yeah.
But if you don't have this structure that makes a group beget groups, then you will not have the evolution of certain properties. So I don't know, somehow my feeling is that the only interesting case where you don't have that grouping is important for selection is the trivial case when, a well-mixed scenario or a random sampling. So there are some extreme cases where, groups are perhaps not that important. But in most cases, grouping, if by grouping you mean some population structure, will be important. That's the same reason why the relatedness coefficient is important. But then the problem is, how do you end up computing this coefficient? It's not enough to say when R is different from 0, then you have some chance of evolving cooperation. Okay, fine. You take, the extreme case where R is 0, and in that case, you can't evolve cooperation. But then if you have a real system, you want to know what is this R, not just that it is different from 0. And what is this R will depend on the kind of structure that the population has. Sorry.
Thank you so much. And yeah, it is a very messy semantics, something I totally agree with.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go for lunch now.